In modules 5A, B, and C, we'll be focusing on infancy and toddlerhood. 5A would be the physical domain, 5B would be the cognitive, and 5C will look at socio-emotional. First stop and take a minute and see if you can remember from our module 1, what time periods are we referring to in infancy and toddlerhood? The next slide will give you the answer to that, so no peeking though. You'll notice that this particular module has been divided in 3 parts, and so is early childhood, and you might wonder why. Well, in part, I'll quote your textbook here, the changes specifically of infancy and toddlerhood are dramatic and obvious and have often been the focus of lifespan psychologists, particularly in terms of their foundational effects for the later years. Now, some researchers say that's a little bit overstated, but within the field of psychology, we really do recognize the effects of infancy and toddlerhood. Dramatic changes, consider a newborn baby versus that person that's a toddler. Amazing differences, changes in height, weight, physically, but also cognitively and intellectually. So although I would love to be able to do a double hit on middle childhood 2, in terms of the weeks in the course and the number of modules, you could only have 2 particular modules that will be given a double amount of time, and it makes all the sense in the world to do with infancy and toddlerhood, and next when we get to early childhood. So we in your text for this particular course will define infancy for the first year of life and use the term toddlerhood for when the baby is toddling, that interesting little high stepping gait that's so cute, from 1 year to year 3. And for both, there's amazingly rapid changes in both the body and the brain, and which we'll consider in our module 5A here. Other textbooks, teachers, researchers might, instead of using the term socio-emotional, or the more laborious emotional social, as psychosocial. So consider psychosocial and the other 2 terms, particularly socio-emotional, to be totally interchangeable. In Module 5A, our focus will be the physical domain, so let's jump right into it, looking at the brain, which, as you can tell, is one of my favorite subjects. Probably not surprisingly, brain development is an interaction between genes and environment, or what other way did we learn to say that? Think for a moment, I'm sure it will come to you. I assume that you're saying to yourself very loudly, nature versus nurture. Nature, of course, referring to the genetic component, and nurture, the learning and environment component. As you know in the slide here, environments are a continuum from being basically the best imaginably possible to being the least favorable imaginably possible. Perhaps if you want to think the least imaginably possible quality environment, maybe think of the case study with Jeannie, raised in the attic. Most children fall somewhere between the best and the worst, hopefully leaning those strongly towards the best. Now, from an earlier chapter, you remember the term for a study that looks at the interaction between genes and environment. Think for a moment and see if you can come up with that term, which was definitely much harder than the nature and nurture term. So hopefully you're thinking epigenetics. Now, it might be obvious how the person's genes can impact them. They're like, let's say they're love of science and nature and a fascination with living things, maybe insects and frogs. Clearly that could be partially genetics. But how would the child impact the environment back the other way? Well, perhaps in terms of creating a little mini ecosystem in their backyard, getting neighborhood kids to help them catch frogs, maybe doing a mini class, or maybe starting a club in high school or college, looking at some environment perhaps uh, related to global warming, global climate change. So clearly it can be two-way directional, and that would be the focus of epigenetics. So if infants and toddlers kept their body proportions, they look more like aliens than people. If you look at the 1-year-old, their head is approximately 1/3 of their body length. Imagine your current body. Look at it right now if you would, because I am doing it. Imagine if your head was 1/3 your body length. It would be huge. Natural births would not be possible. So at that age, the head is 25% of the body to 33%, depending what age you're looking. By 3 years, 18%. And by adulthood, a mere 6%. Now, this pattern of the head being more developed than the extremities refers to, as referred to in the two terms below, the head to tail, literally cephalocaudal, and the pattern in which the chest area is more further advanced than other areas of the body that are more distant. That'd be the proximal distal. You might see an interesting reverse at proximal distal at puberty, with particularly young men of that age with huge hands and feet in proportion to their body. So that would be a reversal of the typical proximal distal that we see, say, as a fetus. The newborn brain will triple in its first 2 years. Imagine your brain size now tripling 2 years from now. It's really impressive if you look at it that way. By age 2, the brain is 3/4 of its adult weight. Again, that is amazing. Why? In particular, is division of a particular type of cell in the brain. A supportive cell, you're thinking neurons, no, that's the main cell in terms of what we study, but it's actually not the most common cell in the brain. As a hint in terms of what cell we're looking at now, you might have learned in intrapsych that they are actually the maker of myelin. And you might be struggling with this one, or you might be shouting it. But anyway, the correct answer would be the glial cell. So they're supportive cells. They do many things, but I think the most fascinating one is they make the neurons myelin. So in the last slide, we learned that myelin is produced by the glial cells. The process is really well underway and beginning at birth, and is going to rapidly increase through the first 2 years of age, and that's why we see that really large growth in the brain size. It'll slow dramatically after that. It's largely finished in the 20s, but there'll be a little bit of a completion, the icing on the cake, up until about age 30, but by and large, the bulk of it is done in the early 20s. By the early 20s. Now, malnutrition affects both the general body and brain long term. If you look worldwide, 1 in 5, in other words, 20% of the world's children are affected by malnutrition. If you look within America, 1 in 5, in other words, 20% of American children have food insecurity, meaning where there is not necessarily always enough food in the house, and there might not be a sureness that there'll be enough food to get through the weekend, the week. So food insecurity is sadly very common in a country that's wealthy. Now, if you're facing food insecurity, do remember that with your college ID, you can sign up for 3 visits to our food pantry on the campus a month, only 1 per week. And I'm told that each visit, depending on what you pick, has no less than $150 worth of grocery in it. So by all means, if you need our food pantry, absolutely use it. And there's frequently baked goods in the hallway, so if you should rush to school and you didn't have time to eat or just didn't have the money, also check to see if there's anything out there. So you'll do your best, same as children, if you have enough nutrition to fuel your body and your brain. before COVID, parents opting out of immunizations was pretty uncommon in this country. In New York State, in order to go to daycare, pre-K, and school attendance, certain vaccines are outright required. Uh, Diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, usually DTaP or Tdap, hepatitis B, the MMR, polio, varicella. If you consider a few of those, varicella, no, chickenpox, people of my age all had chickenpox, and it can be uncomfortable as a child, usually not life-threatening. The problem, though, is it sets you up for later on in life to get shingles. And I don't know if you know anybody with shingles, but shingles are extremely painful. So painful that opiates don't really even take the edge off. It can cause permanent scarring, permanent nerve pain, and it's mostly associated with people maybe 50 or older, but I knew a person in his 20s that got shingles. You might say, well, I'll just get the 2 shots. Well, the 2 shots will make the shingles episode less severe, but you can still absolutely positively get the shingles. Now, next I'm going to pause this and go to the next icon. Let's say that your parents opted out of the MMR and homeschooled you, and you get measles, mumps, or rubella as an adult. This could easily leave you sterile. Also, if a person carrying a baby gets exposed, this could be passed to the baby, causing such severe deficits as permanent blindness, intellectual disability, or death. Now, in terms of polio, I'm sure anybody listening to this is too young to remember whole wards of hospitals with children and adults, for that matter, on ventilators because they could not breathe on their own, and a whole generation of people that were either using canes or braces or wheelchairs because they got polio, and it was not preventable at that point. I can remember growing up when meeting a child, actually she was more like probably teens, and my mother was very angry that this person had polio because her mother could have prevented it with just a simple vaccination. The chart on the left shows you by state which are the most and the least vaccinated states, and we're pretty high in terms of vaccination, which is just good to know. So before you opt out, definitely consider it, and I will just mention opting out of COVID. Right now, the last statistic I saw for the country is only 11% of people are getting vaccinated. Well, that surprises me because I thought that just everybody lost somebody in COVID. I certainly did, and these people had no choice. There was no COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine maybe will not keep you from getting COVID, but it will keep you out of the hospital, and it will keep you off of being on a respirator in the hospital. So maybe think before twice and make sure you're definitely clear on your reasons if you do opt out of the COVID vaccine. But enough said. So not surprisingly, nutrition affects brain development, and environment also affects brain development, as does genetics, and there's an interplay. And we already had this particular question already, so it should be a slam dunk. So what field recognizes the interaction between genetics and environment? Since it was discussed earlier, and we've only done 11 chapters slides so far, that one I will not answer, but hopefully it's a slam dunk. It's probably quite obvious to you that nutrition affects brain development, and disease or lack of it obviously also affects brain development, but also early relationships. So for example, if you consider the U.S. prior to, say, early 1900s, late 1800s, when there were orphanages, it was not uncommon, this is also true of much of the poorer world, it was not uncommon that for a baby in an orphanage to get enough food but not thrive because the brain needs emotional stimulation. The lack of thriving could actually constitute a condition called failure to thrive. The child would not put on necessary weight, would not grow. And in the severe absence of emotional stimulation, babies can actually die. So not from lack of food, but for lack of human interaction and lack of touch. There's also a lot of research suggesting with preemies that are touched more, that are gently massaged in NICUs, neonatal intensive care units, they'll actually get out of the NICU days earlier, saving them time having little bodies pierced with little needles, and also saving the hospital and the parents tens of thousands of dollars. So humans are a social species at every age, and for normal brain development, we need stimulation. We said that age 2, the brain is 75% of an adult brain, which is still amazing. But what accounts for that other 25%, given that almost all neurons that we'll ever need and have are present at birth? Well, that would be the addition of the certain cell we mentioned before. Can you remember that cell? If you're thinking glial cells, excellent. So indeed, the difference would be the addition of glial cells. In fact, the neurons will actually be eliminated. So a young child at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will actually have more neurons than an adult. How are they lost? Well, two different routes. One is programmed cell death. So if a neuron is not being connected to other neurons, it's just going to be lost. It's going to die. And if it's seldom fired, the synapses, the connections, the spaces, the synapses will be lost. So the neuron itself, primarily through the programmed cell death from lack of use, and the synapses that aren't useful, lost through synaptic pruning. So there's two distinct brain growth periods, one that relates to the time period we're in, and another that will be discussed later on in this course. In terms of where we are now, from birth to age 3, there is a spurt. And again, at 11 or 12. We'll talk about the 11 or 12 one later, but from birth to age 3, again, it's not the increase of neurons. No, not at all. They are pretty much fully present at birth. What we're going to see is a great increase in glial cells and a great increase of myelinization. Let's consider reflexes. This is a partial list. You should know that reflexes, some we're born with and they stay with us our entire life, such as maybe sneezing if something peppery gets in our face, or if somebody taps our kneecap, of course our knee will jerk. But this list below is focusing on reflexes specific to childhood. Instead of defining each, I picked out a nice, very, very short clip so you could learn about it and identify the basic components. Some of them have survival value, some do not. They're just related to temporary brain wiring. As I mentioned, some may reappear with central nervous system or peripheral nerve brain damage. Also, when you're viewing them, look at the picture on the right and try to decide which reflex is being shown. So the child will grip anything very fiercely put in their hand. It's a reflex. The grip is so strong that they could actually support themselves and lift it off the surface. So the picture is indeed showing the palmar reflex. Your text correctly indicates it's important for parents to monitor basic physical growth and make sure the child is within the typical region of the bell curve, within where they should be. But it's equally important to monitor milestones. And how does a parent do this? Well, perhaps one of the best ways is to go to the CDC website. The link I've attached is for the CD website, and it can be broken down by months. It can also be broken down by, if you want to look at linguistic versus other aspects of development, and it also has language options. And you might need to just, for one of the particular lecture questions, go to this and answer a question based onto this website. So just be prepared, you'll want to do that. Milestones are related to maturation of the brain, not learning. So the baby is not learning to hold up their head or stand up. We might say the child is learning to walk, but really it's maturational. Same thing with linguistic milestones that we'll look at later. The child's not learning to coo or learning to babble. Again, it's a milestone related to the development of the brain. So let's consider just a few of the very biggest motor milestones. Typically holds head up around 2 months, sitting alone close to 7 months, standing alone very quickly after that, 8 months, toddling a year-ish, more variability here, but a year-ish, walking alone at about 18 months. Initially, the walking might include things like walls or furniture. Let's consider sensory ability of the newborn. Starting with touch, very well developed, as we saw in earlier slides, necessary for physical growth and psychological well-being as well. Extreme lack of it can result in failure to thrive or even death. Smell, very well developed. Basically, as soon as we can get the baby to testing, within days even, the baby can tell mom from other mothers and prefers mom. Smell and taste are often called the chemical senses, often related because of this, or they are frankly related because of this. Taste is well developed. Babies love sweet, as adults do. They do not like milk that's been tainted, such as with tobacco or alcohol, if mom's a smoker or a drinker. Or they also don't like cabbage as well, if mom's been eating cabbage. Hearing is well developed. They like the human voice above other sounds, and they quickly learn and know and prefer mom's voice. Vision is the least developed, and we'll consider vision and visual milestones on the next couple slides. I like this slide because it clearly shows the progression of vision. So before 3 months, vision is quite poor. At 3 months, it's really not bad. Color is almost there, and by 6 months, very nice. Now, if you're thinking about what color to decorate a nursery in, for at least the first, 3 or 4 months, a color scheme with a lot of black and white would be actually preferred according to test for the newborn and young infant. They're better able to see the color contrast, and actually can be nice for adults if you put a little bit of color here and there, but black and white is a great choice for decorating the nursery of the infant. So let's consider just a couple visual milestones. Focusing, ends around 2 months. The best distance is around 18 inches, a foot and a half, which should be roughly mom or dad or the caretaker's face when they're holding the baby, so that's perfect. Color vision, as we saw in the previous slide, not really much before 2 months. Depth perception, 5 months. How do we study it? The apparatus on the right called the visual cliff. Now I just actually did this entire slide narration describing it, but I decided not to. I want you to go into that little short clip starting at 54 seconds and see how this visual cliff experiment and test works. So go ahead and actually do it now if you will.